discriminate. But generally speaking, if a person gets that high on the political scale,
Right.
then their skin gets progressively tougher. If you're
Okay.
going to be in politics, you've got to expect to take the slings and arrows. In the last 2 weeks, because of the Russian collusion myth,
Right.
my wife has been threatened, my children have been threatened, my grandchildren have been threatened, my dogs have been threatened. People criticize my hair, my clothes, my skin. As if attacking me will make the truths that I expose go away.
Well,
so you can't let that get to you. You just have to keep fighting.
Would you say Trump, compared to the previous presidents, is more thin-skinned when it comes to whatever the political attack may be?
Certainly more combative. I mean, that has always been his nature. If you come at him, you better expect that he's going to come back at you.
Reagan wasn't as like that thin-skinned.
No, but I also think, just overall, if you look at it historically, Andrew Jackson, vulgar, a hillbilly,
No question.
crude,
Right.
Violent, insane, turned out to be a pretty good president.
Correct.
Theodore Roosevelt, an egomaniac, a press hog, a self-promoter, a lightweight, turns out to be one of our greatest presidents. So I don't think you can't judge Obama because it's too recent. I mean, I think you can only judge Obama, with the benefit of rear view vision. Same thing is true of Trump, who's only been president for 4 months, perhaps 3. It's a completely different leadership style. He'll adjust to it or he won't. But every president has had their own style, and rather than fit the new president into a system designed by others,
Right.
he's going to have his own system. Most presidents have used an organizational system in the executive branch that was designed by Bob Haldeman for Nixon, which was extremely efficient because it allowed the president to get multiple points of view in a succinct way so he could know everything he needed to know about a subject before making a decision. And that's the way Trump likes to operate. He wants to know all the facts, then he'll ask some very tough questions, and then he'll make decisions.
But let's go back to Nixon very briefly, since years before. There was a bunch of movies that have been out. I'm sure you've seen them. Most notably is the Oliver Stone film about Nixon, and made him sound like very thin-skinned. I know you said that they're not, but the movies portray them. If anything, it's anything negative.
In Nixon's case, he bears it all inside. I mean, he's got the nervous grin, and you can tell he's furious,
Right.
but he's containing it. In 1962, that contained anger boils over, and he attacks the media. And what does he say as he's leaving? He said, "God, that felt good. I've wanted to do that for so long." So Nixon is he's a complete contradiction in terms. It's far too complicated for us to explain in this video.
Right.
That's why historians, those who love him, those who hate him, that's why people are still fascinated with him, because he does very great things. Saves Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, opens the door to China behind the back of the Hawks at the Defense Department, reaches a strategic arms limitation agreement with the Soviets, desegregates the public schools, launches the Environmental Protection Agency, and then he makes egregious mistakes, taking us off the gold standard, wage and price controls, and not last but not least, the ignominious failure that is the war on drugs. So, he's great and flawed. For those who collect political art as we do,
Right.
He's obviously the perfect candidate for a caricature.
Of all the people that you work for, this is a good question. Any of them that actually collected political posters, buttons, campaign material from your memory?
I don't think so. I was a very avid collector when I was much younger, and then
Before you even worked for anybody?
Well, kind of contemporaneous. My first campaign was for managing a state senate race in 1966,
Okay.
and then Nixon ran for president in '68, and I was the Connecticut state coordinator for youth for Nixon. At a certain point, however, I could either be a full-time participant or I could collect the stuff that was being used in the campaign, but I really didn't have time to do both.
Right.
So I only really began to take my things out of storage and hang them, display them. We're now in a process of photographing everything, every piece.
And you're working on a book too,
for an
aren't you?
archive. We're going to produce 2 coffee table books. One is called Tricky Dick, The Impact of Richard Nixon on Popular Culture, 1947 to today. And the other one is untitled, but it'll be a bipartisan volume of political paraphernalia at the presidential level from both parties.
I know you've got thousands
Can
of...
I grab some water there, gentlemen? Producer, could you? We'll go live to the water, thank you. Here's to Marco Rubio.
I know you got thousands of pieces, and I'm sure you're gonna get. I have to ask this question: your favorite button, poster, sticker of? I knew you got thousands of stuff.
Yeah,
What would
it's a very hard choice. I've talked about this several times, and therefore I've now been attacked on Twitter about it. But my Nixon bong is one of my favorite pieces because it's a counterculture piece to protest Nixon.
Okay.
But it's very cool. My
favorite poster.
The Nixon for Governor poster, Give California a Decisive Leader, which was really a bus card. That came in 3 sizes. I have all 3. Very hard to find. I had to go to war on eBay to buy them. I overpaid for one and underpaid for the others. So,
what about button? Favorite button?
the one that says "See Dick Run," funny, funny Dick. That one. I think it's clever.
Was it from the Nixon campaign?
Oh yeah,
itself?
from the 60s. Well, it was probably put out by the Kennedy people in 1960. So it is. It's a great hobby.
You collect the anti stuff too?
I do. There was one time when my collection was much broader. So
Okay.
I was collecting at the presidential level and at the state level in the states where I live. So I had a very extensive Connecticut collection.
Right.
And then I had an enormous collection for Wendell Willkie. Now, as you know, it is literally impossible to have every Willkie piece. I think they made more buttons than he got votes, and they're very diverse. I liked the design. I was always intrigued by his rise. His nomination is as improbable as Trump's nomination. He comes out of nowhere. He's a delegate to the 1936 Democratic Convention.
Interesting.
And he is the 1940 Republican nominee for president, beating Tom Dewey, Bob Taft, Arthur Vandenberg. I mean, that's a pretty heavyweight field. And he's a national advertising phenomena. In other words, a bunch of guys in the Eastern establishment wing of the party decide that the other candidates aren't acceptable, and they decide to create a candidate. They find Willkie, who's a lawyer for utility, and they make buttons and posters and so on. They build his appeal around. He first surfaces on Information Please as a contestant
Wow.
in a game show, but an intellectually based one. That's really how he becomes a national figure. I really enjoyed collecting his stuff, but it was so broad that it was never ending. At least with Nixon, there are certain rare pieces that I have found. And while I don't claim to have the
Majority of them?
recognize my Nixon collecting is divided into
Different groups.
1960, 1962, 1964 draft efforts that were secretly funded by Nixon, 1968, 1972.
Which of your largest collection is Nixon, then, right?
Oh, without any question. I sold off or traded away much, not all, but much of my non-Nixon collection.
Wow, that must have been hard to do.
Well, it was, particularly letting the Willkie stuff go because I'd worked so hard to assemble it. But I figured out that Willkie was a commie, and well, he was certainly left of center. I still maintain a large Goldwater collection as well because it was my first campaign. It was the first time I understood that politics was show business for ugly people.
Did you ever talk to Nixon about the other politicians that were that were senators, for example, or congressmen? Did that ever come up?
Well, Nixon was not a loquacious or a warm and fuzzy guy until he got a couple cocktails in him, and then you could, on occasion, if he was in a good mood, you could get him to talk about Eisenhower or Joe McCarthy or Prescott Bush and all of his contemporaries. He had, having a 40-year run in American politics and being on 6 national tickets, he had an encyclopedic knowledge of people and places in those campaigns, and when you could get him to talk retrospectively, he knew the giants of the era. He had been with Churchill, he had been with de Gaulle, he had been with Adenauer, he had been with Eisenhower.
So the movies that portrayed him, that he hated John JFK and RFK passionately, is that true or not true?
Well, there's a deep level of resentment there. Dick Nixon worked for everything he ever had. His parents were dirt poor. John Kennedy's Profile in Courage Pulitzer was paid for by Daddy, and Ted Sorensen wrote the book. Jack Kennedy didn't even write it. So he liked Kennedy on a personal level. They came to the house together. The Kennedys were lavish donors to Nixon's Senate campaign against Helen Douglas. They hated Helen Douglas. The Kennedys were not liberals. They were pragmatists and anti-communists. Joe Kennedy was probably actually a right-winger. And Nixon resented the fact that he viewed John Kennedy as a true war hero, but beyond that, somebody to whom everything had been handed. And the truth is, Jack Kennedy did have a reputation as a playboy and a bit of a lightweight, but he was also very handsome, very charming, very cultured, all the things that Nixon was not. So there's a resentment there that I think fuels him. It fuels his drive to succeed. I'm not going to be beat by these wealthy Ivy League son of a bootlegger.
So I know it's easy to say what if, but if had Bobby Kennedy not been assassinated, and again had been the nominee, which would have been a tough haul because Humphrey had all the delegates lined up, even though he didn't run in the primaries, you think Nixon would have beaten Kennedy?
See, this is one of the great pieces of Camelot lore. The Kennedyites would tell you, had Bobby not been assassinated, he would have won the nomination.
That's difficult.
Let me take this apart piece by piece. Yes, if Mayor Daley crossed the President of the United States and switched his votes to Kennedy, I don't think that was going to happen. Now, he was going to win the general election. Here's why they are wrong. Jack Kennedy beat Nixon by carrying a string of deep southern states. Bobby was so hated in the South, he would not have carried a single state his brother carried.
Okay.
So very hard to get to 270 electoral votes. The truth is, Nixon wanted Bobby. It made him nervous, but it would have been great vengeance for the election of 1960. And Bobby, could not do what Jack could do 8 years previous: carry Mississippi, carry Louisiana, carry Georgia.
Okay.
Nixon had done well in the border South in 1960, Kentucky, Tennessee, and so on. Not as well as Eisenhower. But by 1968, the country was more polarized. Whites had fled the Democratic Party in the South.
They went to Wallace.
I don't know how Bobby would have gotten to 270 electoral votes without a single Southern state.
Well, Wallace was in the race too, so he collected the Southern votes too.
He did, that's what's so masterful about Nixon's ability to win. He wins despite the fact he's got Wallace draining votes from him on his right, which he has to contain. He needs to not turn off the Wallace people, hoping that they will come around to realizing that Wallace has no chance and prefer Nixon over Humphrey, so he can't attack Wallace. He largely has to ignore him. Wallace is, mostly in contention in the South, but Nixon still manages to carry most of the border South, which is what he requires.
Compare 2016 to 1968 as far as the contentiousness of it. Would you say it's the same level?
Very, very, very similar. The country was at a crossroads then. It was at a crossroads now. It was in crisis then. It's in crisis now. People don't recognize that Nixon's whole ability to have a comeback is based on the murder of John Kennedy, the Vietnam War, the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King, and of course ultimately the murder of Robert Kennedy. Without those events, Nixon probably was washed up. He probably was done, but you got to an episecond in history where at least a plurality of Americans wanted someone they were familiar with and comfortable with, and
Right.
they knew was not flashy perhaps, but solid.
But he would have beaten Bobby Kennedy anyway.
I think he may have beaten Bobby. It would have been a different race.
Right.
But you can play this what-if game. I also think, oddly enough, that Nixon would have been a better. I think he was a great president in many ways, but I think he would have been a better president had he been elected in 1960, because he had more of the Eisenhower people around him, and they were more seasoned, and there was more of a free-flowing exchange of ideas. By 1968, Nixon, having been scalded in 60 and 62, is now a total control freak. He will listen to no one. I mean, recognize that in the 1960 campaign, he was narrowly favored. He makes a bad decision about doing the debates. He makes a bad decision about visiting all 50 states. He cannot decide whether he's going to aggressively court what they then called the Negro vote, or whether he's going to run after white racist Democrats in the South. He tries to have it both ways. He never really makes that decision. He was the pivotal figure in the passage of the 1958 Civil Rights Act. He's got a letter from Dr. King telling him that he, Dick Nixon, put them over the top because the Southern segregationist Democrats, wouldn't vote for the bill. So he tries to finesse that question. That fails. Kennedy breaks that lock by calling Mrs. King. Nixon had been urged to do so by several of his aides, and the lawyer in him said, "Well, for me to call, the judge in the case and then call Mrs. King would be inappropriate." Kennedy didn't care about inappropriate. He cared about symbolism and votes. So that mistake, the disaster of the debates, which is a much longer story, and he still comes within an eyelash. A lot of this has to do with the fact that Eisenhower finally gets out in the last week and
Right, he didn't really campaign for him.
Well, there's a backstory there too. He wanted to. Mamie Eisenhower goes to the Nixons and says, Ike is gravely ill. His heart really can't stand another campaign. Please don't ask him to campaign for you. Now, every time Eisenhower volunteers to campaign, Nixon says, no, thank you. And Eisenhower's furious. What's wrong with this ungrateful son of a bitch? I want to go out on the road and attack this kid Kennedy. So, and by the way, for a guy who was gravely ill, he lived another 9 years.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in any event.
Worst, in your modern era, worst president? Jimmy Carter?
No. That's a very difficult question. Perhaps George H.W. Bush.
Really?
Because he has this mandate and he does nothing with it. He is without any fundamental principle. He wants to be president to be president. If I have to sound like a Reagan Republican, I'll sound like that. He ran for the Senate in 1964. He was a Goldwater Republican. When he ran for the House in 66, he was a liberal Republican. So I think that he squandered a lot. And of course, he ends Reaganism. Read my lips, no new taxes. He raises taxes. That's the symbolic end of Reaganism, in my view.
Interesting. I would have thought that you would have said Carter for sure.
Well, I mean, I am not a fan of the Bushes. I have written a book about it, The Bush Crime Family, which will be out in paperback in June. I think that the Bushes and the Clintons represent a bipartisan duopoly of the elites of both parties. And my real problem here is not just that the country has gotten poorer and less safe, but the Clintons and the Bushes and their cronies have gotten much, much richer, while the rest of us have gotten poorer. Their policies are killing the country, but they themselves are doing extremely well.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Many thanks.
We dropped the button.
You see, buttons can bring people together.
I have a big, huge Alan Cran.